something about H.G. Wells. Herbert George Wells. He was born on 21st of September 1866 and died on 13th of August 1946. We're almost a year before we found independence in India. Here's something about H.G. Wells. He was very famous as H.G. Wells. He was an English writer, prolific in many genres. He wrote dozens of novels, short stories, and works of social commentary, history, satire, biography, and autobiography. His work also included 2 books on recreational war games. So I wonder if you know recreational war games. You have war games you play on your mobile, but he wrote books on those war games. You can understand how much ahead of time he was, from his contemporaries. So you could play those games in reality, and those were also used as practices for wars, and so these were. He was very, very famous for that. Wells is now best remembered for his science fiction novels and is often called the father of science fiction, along with Jules Verne and the publisher Hugo Gernsback. Actually, you know about Jules Verne. Jules Verne was the writer who wrote Around the World in 80 Days. So if you have, most of you must have seen the movies. I know you would not read but see the movies. Anyway, so Jules Verne was also, he used a lot of science, his imagination in that. So he also was very imaginative. And the publisher Hugo Gernsback, he himself was a man of science, and he published many books on science fiction. He wasn't really a writer, but he published all those books and he got them together. So that's why these people called him, and he was called after these people, father of science fiction. H.G. Wells was called the father of science fiction. He was a futurist. He wrote a number of utopian works and foresaw the advent of aircraft, tanks, space travel, nuclear weapons, satellite television, and something resembling the World Wide Web. So you can understand how imaginative, how wide his mind was, and he wrote all these books, and in his books he wrote about the aircraft and the tanks and space travel, etc., which has all, and of course, wonder of wonders, he wrote about the World Wide Web in his books. So he was really a very futuristic man. His science fiction imagined time travel, alien invasion, invisibility, and biological engineering, which is now we are facing. So H.G. Wells had already imagined all that. Brian Aldiss referred to Wells as the Shakespeare of science fiction. So you can understand how high he is held, what a high standard he has in literature, and especially in science fiction. Wells rendered his works convincing by instilling commonplace detail alongside a single extraordinary assumption, and that is dubbed now as Wells' law. So what did he do? He would take a very simple topic, but then he would, along with that simple topic, he would give an extraordinary assumption, means imagine, extraordinary imagination. And that is what is called now Wells' law. His most notable science fiction works include The Time Machine, that he wrote in 1895, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, 1897. This chapter is part of this novel, The Invisible Man. The War of the Worlds, that was in 1898, and the military science fiction The War in the Air in 1907. So he wrote all these science fiction books, and very interesting at that. Wells was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times. He was nominated for it. Novels such as Skips and The History of Mr. Polly, which describe lower middle class life, led to the suggestion that he was a worthy successor to Charles Dickens. You have heard of Charles Dickens, a great English writer, and who wrote about the lower middle class people and ordinary people. And people say that H.G. Wells was a worthy successor of Charles Dickens. So that's high standard of literature. That is how he maintained it. So we must be very, very thankful to Mr. Wells for giving us a beautiful and a wonderful, rich source of science fiction. And I think based on H.G. Wells's science fiction books, many people have wrote their own science fiction, and of course many movies have been made. You can see all these, the Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and all these books have been turned into movies. So when you have the time, you can watch these movies. So I have given you a detailed introduction of H.G. Wells because we need to know, we need to broaden our minds, we need to understand the source of what we are reading and why the writer wrote the fiction in such a way. So that is the high standards of literature that is maintained for your text here, because I think all the students are supposed to understand the high standards of literature that is available for us. Okay, now children, now we come to the text here. I'll read out the text for you. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh, muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. So, the two boys started. Started means when you are startled at something. Suddenly when there's a bang and you are suddenly afraid, you jump. That's started. So, they started in surprise. And why were they surprised? They were shocked because they saw the muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. They're bare feet and there are muddy imprints of those bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? So this is the middle of London and the barefooted man is there. What's he doing there? And where was the man? They could not see the man. As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. Remarkable means extraordinary sight met their eyes. What did they see? A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Suddenly they were watching, so they could see fresh footmarks appeared just as they were watching. Further, footprints followed, one after another. So footprints follow one after the other, descending the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed, fascinated. They were fascinated by it, so captured by it, until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter and at last disappeared altogether. So there were imprints. They could not see the man. They could only see the footprints appearing one by one in front of them. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. Well, actually, it was a mystery. Of course, you would be startled too and you would be bewildered. What has happened? Why? How come you will say there's a ghost around? Well, those boys were brave enough to follow the footprints that were appearing one by one. So, but there was a simple explanation. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. So there was a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent, or rather invisible. Griffin, the scientist, his name was Griffin. The scientist had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body would become invisible. So he conducted many experiments and finally he came up with the idea that human body could be made invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. So he found those rare drugs and he swallowed them, and his body would become as transparent as a sheet of glass. But then, although you could not see the body, you could still touch it because it was as solid as that sheet of glass. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. Well, he was actually a lawless person, which means he did not like to follow the law. He was a lawless man. His landlord disliked him and tried to eject him. Eject him means tried to turn him out of the house, throw him out. His landlord, in revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. Well, he was such a lawless man that he set fire to the house because the landlord was throwing him out of the house because he was not paying the rent actually. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Now, he was without being seen. What did he do? He swallowed those drugs, and to remain unseen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he became a homeless wanderer without clothes, without money, and quite invisible. So now, because of this, he was now invisible. Of course, he was invisible. He was without clothes and he had no money, and he was really, really invisible. Nobody could see him without any clothes. Thus, he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. So it was him because he was running away from there, because he had set fire to his house and he was moving around homelessly. He was a homeless man now. He was a wanderer. Wanderer means someone who goes from one place to the other without any aim, who has no place to stay. And so he had no money, he had no clothes, he had no home. And so it was his muddy footprints that the boys had seen. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London. But his adventures were by no means over. But his adventures were still on. That was just one little episode, and he could manage running away from the boys. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. Now, this was a bad time of the year. It was midwinter. Midwinter London is really, really cold. And so it was a bad time of the year for him to go without any clothes. Of course, he could feel the cold. He was only transparent. He just could not be seen. And because he wanted to remain transparent, he did not put his clothes on to keep warm. If he put his clothes on, people would see him, or rather they would see the clothes on a man. The air was bitterly cold and he could not do without clothes. Now he needed clothes. It was very, very cold. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. Now you know that all the stores are warm. They have heaters during winter, and of course they have cooling during summer. But here it was winter time, so he stepped into a big slip means go in unseen into a big London store to remain warm. Now he was in there, he remained warm. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. Now what does it mean here? As soon as the doors were shut, the closing time came, people left, all the workers, they left the store. It was a big London store. You can understand how big it would be, like a big store in a mall. So now he had the whole store to himself. And so what did he do? He gave himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding. So he put on the clothes and he fed himself without regard to expense. Well, he would not need to pay for that because he was just in there, and he was going to be unseen there, invisible. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. Well, He fitted himself, put on whatever suited him best. He put on nice clothes, warm clothes. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed hat, a hat with a wide brim. So, he had all these. He became a fully dressed and visible person. Now he was visible because the clothes were on his body. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee. Now, cold meat, actually, cold meat is it's put there for sandwiches or just eaten like that with salad. It is eaten cold. That's why it is called cold meat. And he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Now he was having a gala time. He was having a wonderful time eating. He first of all choosing the best clothes. He chose the best clothes at the store. He put them on. Then he helped himself to food, nice food and coffee. And then after the meal, he had nice sweets and wine. And then he was really enjoying himself. And he enjoyed the warmth too. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts. So he settled down on a pile of quilts. There were so many quilts there, and he had a nice warm bed there. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. Well, everything was not well because there was something went wrong. He overslept. He did not manage to wake up in time. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. So he did not find the time to hide himself. And then the assistants started coming in and he was still sleeping. Assistants means the store workers, all the salesmen or the sales girls. They started coming in. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. So he panicked when he saw a couple of the workers coming towards him. So he started panicking and he began to run. They naturally gave chase. Of course, they would chase him because someone was in the store, and so they started chasing him. When he's running, it means something is wrong, that he's a culprit. So they started chasing him. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So how did he get away? He had to quickly take off his newly found clothes. He has just found them and now he had to take them off. So once more, he found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air. So again he was naked, he had no clothes, without clothes in that chill January air. You can imagine what must have happened to him. Well, we will continue this in the next class and we'll finish the chapter then. Thank you, students.